Let's take a look at the Mishnah on Daf Peyom and Beis. We'll fill in the sugis a little bit later, Mirz Hashem, if we get a chance. The Mishnah says, "HaPesach shenizrak domo v'achkach noda shu tameh." And we've been talking for a long time now about a Pesach that's ba bituma. But here's a very interesting scenario. We're talking about a Korban Pesach. We'll see soon that we're talking about a Nazir. And after the Zrikas Hadam, we find out, to our surprise, that the Bailim, in the case of a Nazir, the Nazir, were actually Tmeim. In the case of a Korban Pesach, we brought the Pesach on behalf of Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi, and they turned, as it turns out, with Tmeim. So we're not dealing with a Korban in which the entire tzibur was tameh, as we discussed yesterday, but rather we're talking about a Korban where the tzibur itself, the kol at large, are tahorim. But these individuals who brought this Korban are tmeim. Now, had we known that they were tmeim, we would not be zorik the dam. But we were unaware of that. So we went ahead and we were zorik the dam. Is the Mishnah says that at tzitz meratza. Now we know that the Kohen Gadol wore the tzitz on his forehead, and the tzitz had the power of being mechaper on tumas korban, and therefore the korban is ol l'rotzon. This is based on a pasuk at the end of Sefer Shmos. It says v'hoyal metzach Aaron, and then it says v'nosa Aaron es avon hakodshim hakadoshim v'hoyal mitzcho tamid l'rotzon lahem lifnei Hashem. And the Gemara darshins that it's maratza on zvachim shenitmu, if the zevach was tameh, that it should be ol l'rotzon. And although the pasuk says b'nasa Aaron es avon hakodshim, the word avon is a very generic, general word, but Chazal understood it referring to Tumah, because since we found the heter of Tumah b'tzibur, Tumah hutra b'tzibur, therefore we assume that if the tzitz is endowed with the power of bringing a ratzon on avon hakadoshim, then it's logical to assume that we're talking about Tumah. Now, later on, we're going to have to analyze what happens in a case where they knew that the basar was tameh, and they went ahead and they were zorik the dam. That's not our case. We found out later on, after the zrika. Now, we have assumed that since the basar was tameh, and this is something that we found out after the zrika, therefore the tzitz is maratz. However, what happens in a case where nitma haguf, that's the second half of this Mishnah. Not that the korban of the basar korban became tameh, which we only found out after the zrika, but rather Bailim had contracted tumah. Let's say, for example, the Nazir or the person who's bringing the Korban Pesach had come in contact with a mess, and in such a case, the Bailim in Pesach at least have to be pushed off to Pesach Sheni. So the Mishnah says Einat Tzitz Maratza. Why is it that the Bailim who brought this Korban Pesach, and unbeknown to them, they were Tmeim, they had come in contact with the corpse, they get pushed off to Pesach Sheni? And the only possible answer is that the tzitz is not Maratza. So what does this mean? Why are we differentiating between the power of tzitz to be maratza on tumas hakarban as opposed to the power of tzitz, which doesn't exist, to be maratza on tumas habaylan? If there's ritzi tzitz on tumas habasar, tumas hakarban, why not ritzi tzitz on the baylan? So the Mishnah, without asking this question, answers this question. Why is it that Einat Tzitz Meratza al Tumas Haguf? Mipnei Amru. Now, Amru could mean a Drabanan, or Amru could mean that the Chacham derives this from a pasuk. Han-Nazir. Now, the Nazir has to bring a karban, actually 3 karbanas at the end of his Nazirus, in order to terminate his Nazirus. And in addition to these 3 karbanos, he's chayav in what's called Giluach HaSa'ar, Seor. And once he completes this entire process, then he's allowed to drink wine. He's allowed to go into a cemetery. Ve'ose Pesach, Atzitz meratz al tumas hadam, v'yein atzitz meratz al tumas haguf. It's an axiom that the tzitz meratza on the tumas hakorban, in this case the dam, but it's not meratza on tumas haguf. So if the nazir was tamei mes at the time that they brought his karban, then he's going to have to start from scratch again and count his Yemei Nazirus with a new malos. And if someone brought a korban Pesach and it turns out that he was tamei, he's going to have to bring a Pesach Sheni, because the tzitz is not maratza al tumas haguf. Now, when it says that the tzitz is maratza al tumas hadam, that's an extra chidush. Meaning, for sure, it's maratza on tumas habasar, whether it be the bas of Eimurim or the bas of Achilas Adam. But the chiddush of the Mishnah is that even in a case where the dam contracted tumah, the tzitz is maratza on the dam. So that would mean that if the dam contracted tumah, the nazir has completed his nazirus, and the korban Pesach was brought, then there's no need for a Pesach Sheni. Now, it's very interesting because the Shalmei Nazir, being the korban Shlomim Nazir, requires that in addition to preparing the basar and cooking it for achila, you have to take the seir of the Nazir and it has to be placed into the fire. That's the mitzvah of the Nazir, to burn his hair. And now the korban, as it turns out, the dam itself was tamei, and we was zorik the dam, and now we're going ahead with the mitzvah of being mavashel, the aisle, right, the shlomim, together with the seir that we're burning underneath this cauldron of fire. And all that is because it's maratza. And again, as we said before, if the guf was tamei, if, again, in the case of korban Pesach, I understand very well that if the person who was bringing the korban contracted tumah by touching a mess, he now has to be pushed off to Pesach Sheni. In the case of the Nazir, as we said before, if he comes in contact with a mess, he's got to start his Nazirus all over again. Where's that from? In Parshas Naso, it says, V'chia mus alav mes, etc. It says, Vayomim arishonim yiplu. All the days that he counted until this point are gone. Remember, we used to play with Etch-a-Sketch? You just shake it up and start from the beginning. Dahainu, shed nazir anitma b'mes, mafsid es kol minyan hayomim sha'avru me'az shekibel olav nazirus. V'tzarch li'tayr, and he has to go and be Matayr himself. Yakach Mona Shuv Yemei Nazirusa Mitchila. Now there's a whole section of Karbonos, a whole set of Karbonos Nazir Chel Tumah in order to complete his Tumah, and then he could start his Nazirus all over again. So that's called Ayomim Harishonim Yiplu. And all this will apply if the Nazir, as it turns out, was Tameh. In the case of Korban Pesach, if the Bailam would Tveim, they have to bring a Korban Pesach Shein. Okay. Now the Mishnah introduces a new concept called Tumas Tahom. And the Tahom, as you know, is below the surface of the earth. And the word Tahom here in this context, a borrowed term, means it's concealed, otherwise known as a suffix. We don't know. Was he Tameh? Was he not Tameh? Nitma Tumas HaTahom Hatzitz Meratz. We said before in the Mishnah that the tzitz is not Meratz on Tumas Haguf. However, if the Nazir or the Mevi Korban Pesach was Nitma B'Tumas Tahom, then the tzitz is Meratz. What is Tumas Tahom? It means that Lo Hoisa Yedua, no one knew about his state of Tumah. It was totally concealed. He says in the footnote here that Tumas Tahom Nikres Miloshan Safek Ve'iyadiyah. Ein Adam Hamakir B'Tumas Zu, Hareu Kitahom She'eno Galui, right? As we said before. V'eina kavonik shesafek hadover nitma adam lo elahu vaday tomik ach b'shoshe nitma lo hikir b'tumazu shum adam. So let's not make a mistake. We know he contracted tumah. We just don't know when. So at time tx we are in a suffix. At time ty we already know that he was tummy, but we didn't reveal his tumah at time tx. So we don't know at that earlier time whether or not he was tummy. So now, the Karban, let's say the Shalmei Nazir or the Korban Pesach was already Mishchat. The Kohen went ahead and he did the Shechita. And later on, we find out that he was Tameh. Was he Tameh at the time of the Shechita? We don't know. That's called Tumas Tahom. And the Tzitz is Meratz. Now again, we're talking about Tumas Bailan, which we said that Tzitz has no power to be Meratz on Tumas Bailam, but yet there's reason in the case of Tumas Tahom. So if we know for sure that the Bailam were Tmeim at the time of the Zrika, and Kolshkin, if we know that already at the time of the Shechita they were Tmeim, then the deal is off. The Korban is invalid and has to be replaced because it's not Meratz on Tumas Haguf. But if we find out later that he was Tameh, but we don't know if he was Tameh at the time of the Akrava. Let's say, for example, at the time of the Shechita. That's called Tumas Tahom, and the tzitz is Meratz. This is Halacha L'Moshe Misinai. Again, we don't have any rationale over here to explain this. And therefore, the Osa Pesach in this case, Yotzi de Chovaso, the Nazir completes his Nazirus, no Pesach Shein. Now we want to add two insights into this Mishnah before we begin the Gemara. First of all, we see that the tzitz is Meratza on Tumas Tahom, even with regard to Tumas Haguf. But the Chazon Ish asks the following kasha. And we'll find a similar kasha in Reb Chaim in Hilchos Bias Mikdash. Nazir shenitma ein apsul mishum tumas bala korban el nazir's atzman isteres machmas tuma asav in kain echi tochik shehat tzitz meratza shelo tistar naziroso. We can say that the tzitz is meratza ala tuma if you're talking about the korban, whether the korban is valid or not valid. In the case of Nazir, we're not dealing with the korban, we're dealing with the Nazir. because if an event that he was Tameh and he brought his Karman, it's all meaningless because he's not a Nazir at that point. He's got to start his Naziris all over again. So what good is Tzitz Maratza? Tzitz Maratza is not going to help you. It could help you for the Karman, but it's not going to help you for the Gavra who might, Ayovim Arishonim Yiplu, has to start his Naziris all over. So that's the Kash. So the Chazon Ish offers the following answer. He says, "B'nazir shenitma yesh shnei chisronos." Number one, hanaziris nisteres machmas hatuma. Ve'al kach nemra alocha b'tumas tahom she'ena soteres nazirus. You hear this? There's halacha l'Moshe Sinai about tumas tahom, that it doesn't undermine his Nazirus, even though, again, there's a 50% chance that he was Tameh. Well, Indians say, Ein Sorech L'Din Tzitz Maratza. This has nothing to do with Din of Tzitz Maratza. It's halacha in Hilchas Nazirus, that Tumas Tahom Eino Soteris Nazirus. Milvadzos, we have to ask another question about the Karbonos. He can't bring his Karbonos in a case of Tumas Aguf, because Tzitz is not Maratz on Tumas Aguf. And on this, we need a din of Maratz, of Ritz. But Chaim adds another point here, that even in Korban Pesach, there's a Chiddush in the din of Tumas Tahom that has nothing to do with Ritzi Tzitz. And that is that the Hutra Tuma Azos, Af She'ena Bailam Ru'uyim La'achila. How could the Karban be Ola when we have a suffix, maybe he was Tameh, and he wasn't Royal Achila? It's like shechting a Karban Pesach Shaloli Ochlo, like a Zokin and a Chola. And on that we have halacha that Tzitzis Maratza. I'm sorry, forget about Tzitzis Maratza, I'm sorry. And that we have halacha that Tumas Tahom does not register and make him into Eina Royal Achila. That's point number one. Now, point number two is, how far are we going to go with Tumas Tahom and introduce the validity of the tzitz? Are we going to allow now to be Zorik the Dam? He says, by Gemara Lahalan, later on, we're going to learn on Daf Pei Aleph that Mutar Af Lizrok L'Chatchila Im Noda Atuma Achar Ashchita V'Lfnei Azrika. So we find out that he was Tameh between the Shchita and the Zrika. And we don't know if he was Tameh at the time of the Shchita, and therefore we have a suffix, are we able to be Zorik the Dam? And the halacha is that the tzitz is Maratza on Tumas Tahom, and we could be Zorik the Dam. And he writes, Lahavdil we didn't reach the tzitz al basar v'dam shenitmu she'eno ela b'di'evedim kfar nizrak adam. In the case of Tumas basar, then the tzitz is Maratza because we didn't know about the Tumah until after he was Zorik the Dam. In the case of Tumas Tahom, we're going to allow the Zrika up front because it's only Tumas Tahom. Now, the Tosefta, which Rashi quotes here, says, Omru lo li osa Pesach, ever haya imcha b'bayis, v'nichnasta bo, tachas ha'even, shashvol leha. So they notify him that there was a dead body in his house, and he had gone into his house, or that he sat down on an Evan. Again, for this you have to know more about Tumas Mes, and there was a kever underneath the Evan. Now, Nodelo, Bain Misha Osa Pischo, Ubein Adshalo Osa Pischo. He says if he was notified and he's in a state of certainty, so therefore it's not called tuhumas tom, then whether they already brought the Pesach or he hasn't yet brought the Pesach, he's out because the Bailim are Tmeim, and in such a case, the tzitz is not Maratz. It's not a Tumas Tahom because they notified him, my friend, on such and such a day at such a time, you had a kever in your house, in your oil, or you sat on a kever. So the korban is batel, and now he has to bring Pesach Sheni. Aval omru lo kever hatahom haya beisak baisha nichnaste bo o tachas ha'evan sheyashavto v'nodalo ad shelo asa pischo tzarich lasos Pesach Sheni. If he finds out about the tumas tahom before he brought the korban, now we're going to push him off to Pesach Sheni because Safek Tomei. But Misha Asa, if they already brought the korban, and then he finds out about Tumas Tahom, Eino Tzarch Lasos Pesach Sheni. Now, there's another question here, which is a long discussion in the Merkavas Mishnah, and the Chazon Ish again gets involved in this, whether or not the tzitz that's maratza on Tumas Tahom will allow him to eat the korban bituma. Because now we know he's for sure Tomei. We're not sure if he was Tomei back at the time of the Zrika, but he's certainly Tomei today. Can we allow him now to eat the korban bitum? All right, let's start the Gemara. The Gemara now is medayek from the language of the Mishnah. Taima, the reason why the tzitz is maratza is because the Nizrak v'achach noda, they only found out about his tumah when and after they did the Zrika. Let's go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, "HaPesach shenizrak dama v'achach nod b'shu tamei." That the korban itself is tamei, found out after the Zrika, and then we say that the korban is ola, it's maratza. But Avol apparently noda bitchila. Notice he finds out before the Zrika Saddam that he was tamei v'achach nizrak adam lo maratza. In other words, he's going to have to bring Pesach Sheni. And that seems to be the implication of the Mishnah quite clearly, that it's only because it was after the Zrika that we found out about the Tumah. And the Ritzit Tzitz is a case of Nizrak v'achach Nod. So it means that as a result of the Tzitz, we can allow him to eat the basar, and of course, he doesn't have to bring Pesach Sheni. Minu, is it really so that if they knew about it before the dam was Nizrak, then there's no Ritzitzitz? And now the Gemara is going to bring a Bryce. Al matz, it's maratza al adam ve'al abasar ve'al chelik shenitma bein b'shogei bein b'mezid bein ba'onis bein b'ratzon bein b'yochid bein b'tzibur. Now it says bein b'shogei or bein b'mezid. It sounds like that mezid means they went ahead and they were zorik the dam, and they shouldn't have been zorik the dam. Otherwise, why do you classify him as a mezid? So it means that he was notified even before the Zrika. Now, we just finished saying that from the Mishnah, it's clear that the tzitz is only maratz because he didn't know about the Tumah at the time of the Zrika. And here it says Mezid, it's Ola. Once again, Mezid means the Kohen knew that the Bailam would tmei him, or I shouldn't say the Bailam, the Dam is Tomei and the Basa is Tomei. They knew about that. The Kohen knew about that before the Zrika. And he went ahead and he was Zorek b'meiz. Nevertheless, but the evidence is Maratz. Amar Avina, how do we reconcile this brisa with our Mishnah? Our Mishnah implies that if the Kohen knew about the Tumah before the Zrika, that would be an invalid carbon. Yet the brisa says Bein b'mezid. Amar Ravina, Ravina says that what's the case of the brisa? It's a different case. We're not talking about Zrika Saddam, but rather Tumah also, the Tumah of the carbon is Bein b'shogeg, Bein b'mezid. Wow, Ravina revolutionizes the whole sugya. We're not talking about Mazid is shogeg with regard to the Zrika. Did he know he was Tomei and he went ahead and he was Zorek to Tam? Forget all that, forget about it. The question is, how did he contract Tumah when he came in contact with the dead? And Bein Mazid, Bein Shogeg, Tzitz Maratza means that even if he deliberately was Matame himself, which assuming he's not a Kohen, that's fine. You want to go into a Beis HaKvaros, and you're not a Kohen. I mean, I'm not saying I recommend it on a daily basis, but there's no prohibition in doing so. So therefore, Bein b'mezid, Bein b'shogeg, Tzitz Maratza. Now, Zrikaso, if you want to know whether the tzitz is maratza, as far as the zrika is concerned, when the carbon was contracted to, then let's differentiate b'shogeg hurtza, b'mezid lo hurtza. The power of ritzit tzitz is only in a case of a shogeg, and that's what the Mishnah means when it says v'achkach noda. We had no idea when we went ahead and we were zorked down that the basa was tameh. We found out after the zrika. That's called b'shogeg. And then the tzitz is maratza. But b'mezid, the Mishnah is telling us by implication that if he knew the Kohen at the time of the zrika that there was tumas bailim, then the deal is off. The carbon is invalid, and there's no ritzit tzitz. Now, what it sounds like to me, before we see inside, is that ritzit tzitz is for an avon, but b'shogeg, not b'mezid. Tzitz is not going to come and save a Kohen who deliberately violated halach, knowing full well of the tumah, he went and he was zorek down. No. Don't fall back on tzitz in that case. The brisa, on the other hand, is talking about the original tumah. How was the tumah contracted? Was it b'mezid or b'shogeg? Okay, now let me just add here the tzlach. 1 second, as a kashi. I just want to find the tziyun. Oh, he says the following. Let's say he finds out before the zrika about the tumah, and then he was zorek. Im shachach shenitma karbon, the zorek b'shogeg atzitz maratz. Fine, that's what we said. Hikshat slach im kain madua hutzachatana linko dafka nizrak v'achach noda, that the tzitz is maratza because only after the zrika found out about the tumah. Ulevarmi tolkach she'im noda kodem azrika, and that would be medayek that if he knew about it before the zrika, the tzitz is not maratza. Areu yochel lichtov, the Tana could have written noda the achakach nizrak. Why didn't the Tana tell me explicitly, address the case where they knew at the time of the zrika that there was too much possible? And then l'chalik ben shogeg l'mezid. Then you should add the question of whether he knew about it, he didn't know about it. So that's the kasha that Tzlach. That Tzlach should have argues that the Mishnah should have gone into detail here about a case of Noda and differentiate between Chogig and Mazid as far as where this Ritzit sits. He brings an answer here from the Meshiv Nefesh, which, if I'm not mistaken, I should look it up, I have it here, is the Nitziv. And he says, Shatana Gotzel Echalik Bein Tumas HaKarmel and Tumas HaGuf. The main thrust and the goal of the Tana of our Mishnah is to differentiate between Tumas Karban, Basar, and Tumas HaGuf. V'al Kain, Kosav, Nizrak, V'achakach Noda, right, so again, the Tzlach was bothered. Why did he mention the case where he knew about it before the Zrika Saddam, but he was a shogeg? So he's saying our Mishnah wants to address the case, or shall we say, contrast the two cases of Tumas Karbon as opposed to Tumas Aguf. Al Kain, therefore, Nokat, Nizrak v'achakach Noda. He only found out about the tumah after the zrika. L'lamed shebetumas haguf afilu b'ofen zeh ein hatzitz meratz. In other words, the greater the shogeg, the more logical, compelling reason or argument there is for ritzitzitz. Which is more of a shogeg? When he knew it before the zrika or when he knew it after the zrika? If he found that after the zrika, that's the spitz, that's the ultimate shogeg. He had no awareness of the tumah at the time of the zrika. And that's the chiddush that the Mishnah wants to contrast between tumas basa and tumas haguf, that even in this extreme case of shogeg, he's mamish shogeg. He went in, he was zork to dam, no one had a clue that there was tumah. We're going to say that in tumas haguf, the carbon is a non-starter. So all this is Ravina. So Ravina will call round one. And we're looking now for a brand new, fresh way of reconciling our Mishnah with the Brisa. So let's go over the Kasha. Our Mishnah implies that if they knew about the Tumah at the time of the Zrika, the carbon is possible. And yet the Brisa says, Bein b'chogig, bein b'mezid, which sounds like the Kohen knew about the Tumah and he went ahead, nevertheless, deliberately, and he was Zorik Adam. So Rav Shila Omar, to some extent, Rav Shila is going to be the exact reverse of Ravina. Rikaso, bein b'shogig, bein b'mezid, hurtza. In other words, at the time of the Zrika, did he knew about the Tumas carbon or did he not know? And the Bryce is telling us it makes no difference. Even if he knew B'shas Zrika about the Tumah, he was amazing. Nevertheless, the tzitz is maratz when he goes ahead and he was zorik the dam. And that's the subject of the Bryce. Our Mishnah would agree to this din, and the Gemara is going to try to explain as we go along. But as far as Tumah of the Karban, then the Ritza is only in the case of Nitma, B'shogeg, Hurtza. So again, there's one piece of the puzzle that we haven't figured out yet. Ravina is assuming that in a case of Yada B'shas Zrika, he knew very well at the time of the Zrika that the carbon is Tameh. Nevertheless, B'di'evid is going to be a Ritzui, meaning the tzitz is Maratza. And that's the case of the Bryson. Again, this is really very revolutionary that he knew that there was Tumas Basar, and he went ahead and he was Zorik the Dam, which he wasn't supposed to do. And all of a sudden, the salvation comes, and we bring in the big gunners, and that's the tzitz, and the tzitz is maratza. We have to figure out, how. And again, he's saying, Ravina, that the Mishnah agrees to that. However, if you talk about Tumah also, where the original Tumah was contracted, when it was contracted, and meaning how the Basa became Tameh, is then B'shogig Hurtza, B'mezid Lo Hurtza. Now, in the Rishonim here, he quotes all the Rishonim that this is all a D'Rabbanan. This cannot be a D'Oraisa Halach. So as it comes out like this, both Ravina and Rav Shilo agree that B'Oraisa the tzitz is maratza, even in the case of Mezid, which means that the original Tumah was contracted b'Mezid. They argue, in what case did the Rabbanan introduce a penalty, a knas, and suspend the power of the tzitz to be maratz? So as it turns out, Rav Shilo is saying that if the Tumah itself was b'mezid, the Rabbanan are going to step in and they're going to suspend the power of the tzitz maratz. That's clear according to Rav Shila. Let's go back for a minute to Rav Zera, to Ravina. And Ravina says that as far as the tumah, the carbon is concerned, bein v'shogeg bein b'mezid, but as far as the zrika is concerned, then we're going to be machalik between mezid and shogeg. So again, everyone's dealing here with a knas. Ravina is talking about a knas because he knew at the time of the zrika that there was too many. Went ahead, he was zorek. We're not going to allow. We're going to suspend the power of the magical power of the tzitz. And Rav Shilo is talking about where he knew at the time of the tumah and deliberately went ahead and was metame. Then we're going to apply the knas, and the rabbanan is not going to be reached. Ravina, this is a summary of Tosfos elsewhere. Zrikas davar tamei b'mezid. If he went ahead and he was zorik the dam b'tumah, chamura yoseh. That's worthy of a knas. He really violated a severe violation. Kevan shamakra b'tumah. If a person brings to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the process of hakrava tumah, that's maguna davar b'yoseh. I mean, that's again intuitive. If you talk about a place for knas, I understand that the zrika of tumah deserves a knas. But I'm really bothered by Rav Shila. Achla Rabbi Shimon atuma b'mezid chamur yosef. Why is that? Lefisha v'kach hiskil lifsolas hakarbon. So Rabbosai, we're not talking about a person who visits a cemetery on a Monday or a Thursday. That's not an issue. We're talking about a person who brings a carbon and walks into a cemetery deliberately, which basically passes the carbon. Avalat zorik b'tumah fiu b'mezid ein lekot, so came into who hiskil b'psul, shalo hiskil b'psul, v'af makayev mitzvah b'shas zrika. Now, I can't tell you I understand every single word here, but the general impression, begadol, is that if he was tummy and yet he went ahead and he was zorik the dam, he's still involved in a mitzvah. And again, he didn't start the process of the carbon akrava bipsul. The shchita, for example, etc., was from his perspective, Tara, he only finds out about the Tumah B'Shas Zrika, the last of the Avodos. Masha Enkin, a person who's bringing a carbon, and then he deliberately goes into the cemetery from the get-go, the carbon is possible. He is actually postling the carbon. He deserves the Knas. That's the Shita of Rabbi Shila. Now, we still didn't finish Rabbi Shila. The Ela Hadaktani, the Brisa says that Almat Sitzmaratz al Adam. And it says, Bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid. Now, again, according to Rav Shilo, this knas depends on the zrika. Correct? Zrika, so bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, is hurtza. Right? Zrika, so bein b'mezid, bein b'mezid is hurtza. And now we go back to the Mishnah. Almat sitzmaratz al adam el posval chelik shenitma bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid. I mean, it sounds like we're talking about the Zrika. According to Rav Shilo, the whole issue here and the knas that we were talking about is about the tumah, being metame. Let's see how he reinterprets the Mishnah. Nitma b'shogeg, uzrako bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid hurtza. So we don't care, according to Rabbi Shilo, about the fact that he was zorek b'tumah deliberately. What we care about that he passled and he was metame the carbon deliberately. See, I said before, let me correct something. I think I went a little too far when I said he walked into a Beis HaKvaros. Do you remember I said that? If you remember, I'd rather if you forgot. That's not the point here. The point is that he was metame the carbon b'mezid. That's why he deserves a knas, and we're going to suspend the operation of the tzitz. Okay, now Rabbi Shilo wants to wrap it up. And hadik tani dam shenizrak v'achkach noda, which sounds like the whole shogeg here is because of the zorek who was unaware of the fact that he was being zorek b'tumah. According to Rabbi Shilo, that's really irrelevant. And our diak was taima the nizrak v'achkach noda, and we would die from the Mishnah that noda v'achkach nizrak. He knew about it and he was zorik the dam b'mezid. Low, in that case, there's no ritzui tzitz. No one's coming to salvation if he went ahead and he was zorik the dam b'tumah, which is against Rabbi Shilo. He says, no, that's not what the Mishnah means. Who adin afilu noda v'achkach nizrak. According to Rabbi Shilo, he doesn't deserve a knas, even though he knew the basar was coming. He went in and he was zorik the dam. So that's called b'mezid. The tzitz is nevertheless maratze, and the Rabban are not going to suspend the ritzui tzitz v'haidik tani. Now, what are we going to do with the language of the Mishnah? Mizrak v'achach noda, which means it all depends upon whether he knew about it during the time of the Zrika or he didn't know about it. According to Rabbi Shilo, that's irrelevant. Is mishum de boile misnei seifa, since at the seifa of the Mishnah to differentiate between tumas basar and tumas aguf, is nitma aguf einat tzitz meratze afilu nizrak v'achach noda lo. So the Mishnah only mentions the case of nizrak v'achach noda to tell you that even in that case, where he's the most extreme shogeg, he had no awareness at all of the tumah at the time of the Zrika. Nevertheless, As far as Tumas Haguf is concerned, Eino Maratza, because the tzitz is not Maratza on Tumas Haguf. Okay. Now he has a kasha here from Tosfos. Kevan she'ikar tirus Rabbi Shilo, who shemishna seinu eino bedafka elagamim nizuk adam b'meizid atzitz maratz madua hutrach lahosif ulachalek legabi tuma shem nitma b'meizid ein atzitz maratz. Sharei efshal lefai shabraisa osekes gam b'tuma v'gam b'zrika. Shekain b'shogeg bein b'shogeg bein b'meizid atzitz maratz. So he could have just said that the Bryce is dealing also with a case of Tuma and Zrika, both. The Tirates, Tevem es chiluk zechel Rebbe Shilo nemar kedei liyashev stira acheres. Okay, fine. Nitva, the Gemara says that in the Mishnah, if the Nazir or the Osei Pesach contracted Tuma, is if it was Tumas Tahom, then at Tzitz Maratza, boy, Rami Bar Chama, Kohen Hamaratza b'korban Osei, the Kohen who's being makriv the carbon of the Nazir or the Osei Pesach, is question Hutralo Tumas Hatahom, Olo. I'm not sure I understand. One second. Until now, we were talking about what? Where the Nazir contracted Tumas Tahom. Now, Rabbi Baruch wants to know what if the Kohen himself contracted Tumas Tahom? So I'm not sure if he's asking in such a case where the Kohen could go ahead and do the avoda. Let's see, maybe the Gemara will clarify this because I'm not sure exactly what the suffix of Rabbi Bar Chava is. Okay, fine. The Kohen contracted Tumas Tahom. Mi Amrina, the Chi Gmiri. Gmiri means Halacha Moshe Sinai. Tumas Tahom. That's B'Bailim Al B'Kohen Lo Gmiri Dilma Bizvacha Bizivcha Gmiri. Lo Shna B'Kohen Lo Shna B'Bailim. So what exactly is the suffix here of Rami Bar Chama? Are we talking about going ahead and be makriv the karma? I don't know. It's not clear. Let me just see if by chance he adds anything here. Concerning the Kohen who affects acceptance for the Kohen who does the avoda is Tumah of the deep, he calls it. Okay, that's a literal translation. Permitted for him or not. Ordinarily, he writes, if a Kohen who is Tameh does the avoda of a carbon yachid, he says the offering is invalid. Rami Bar Chama inquires whether this invalidation pertains even to the case of Tumah of the deep. Oh, this is what I was looking for. If it was discovered after the avoda, in the case of a Pesach or a Nazir, that the Kohen who implemented the avoda had been tamei, but it was an undetermined suffix tuma called tumas tahom. Is the offering accepted post facto? All right, I don't know why the Masechet I didn't see added that. I intuitively I felt that was the case of Rami Bar Chava. I wasn't sure about it because he doesn't spell it out. He says hutralo tumas hatom lo. I mean, hutralo sounds like you're asking him, before the fact if he's allowed to be makriv of the korban, and that for sure is not a possibility. We're not going to let him. He's a suffix tamei this Kohen. But post facto, can we say that there was ritzi tzitz because it was only a suffix tumah? My Rava Tashma. So Rava says that I can prove one way or the other about this suffix. The Tani Rabbi Chia, we have a brayso. Rabbi Chia lo amru tumas tahom el lemeskel vat. So the tzitzis maratza only kishenitmu b'meskel vat, but not tumas acheros, not even tumas tahom. So let's be medayik in the lashon of this brayso. Mes limute mai, right? It says el lemeskel vat. So it means that there are different categories of tumas tahom. One category is where we're not sure if at that moment in time he had sat on a kever. What about other tumas? Limuute, lav limute, tumas hatahom de sheretz. So the sheretz was covered up, I guess, and we don't know exactly at what point he had contact with the dead sheretz. Later on, he finds out that what was covered up, and he didn't know about it, what was inside the package was a dead sheretz. In such a case, einat tzitz meratz. Now, honestly, I have no clue. What's the difference between tumas tahom of tumas mes, and tumas tahom of sheretz? Now, I would say kal v'chomer if the power of the tzitz is to be meratz on tumas mes, which is a tum of 7 days, how much more so of tumas sheretz, which is a tum of 1 day? The tzitz should certainly be meratz. Oh, he says, "V'afal gav shetumas mes chamura yotze mitumas sheretz." Oh, he says because mes is metami be oil. If you're in the same oil as sheretz, you're not covered. It's only negia. All right, I would have said Sheva versus 1 day. He says, "Ein limo b'kavachomer b'masha tzitz meratz al tumas tahom shel sheretz." Let's learn from a kavachomer that if tumas mes is lends itself to reaching to how much more so the tuma kala of tumas sheretz. Says kevon sharitzu tzitz b'tumas tahom halach l'moshe misinahi is klalu she'ein l'meidim kal v'chomer me'alacha l'moshe misinahi. This I didn't know. This is new to me. You gentlemen, you don't want to embarrass me. You knew this from Kadmus Danan. You didn't want to tell me. Did you know such a thing, that with regard to Halacha Moshe Misina, there's no Kal V'chomer? And I would have said Kal V'chomer. If there's Halacha of Kal V'chomer with regard to that which is explicit in the Torah, how much more so is that which is not even Doraisa, it's only Halacha Moshe Misina, which is 1 notch lower, how much more so I should be deriving Kal V'chomer? I mean, one thing you see over here that, there's obviously more to the game than what I'm mentioning here, but that Kal V'chomer is a midah shator nidreshes for him. It's not just pure logic and the rules and the boundaries, when kal v'chomer can be applied and when it cannot be applied. Like, for example, we have a principle called ein od shemin din. That's also, in a sense, a technical restriction in the scope and the power of the kal v'chomer. We have another technical restriction that kal v'chomer cannot be applied in halacha Moshe Sinai. I'll give you an example. I mean, this is just bedichusa. Don't take me seriously. But Arla and Chutzlaritz is halacha Moshe Sinai. Correct? So I'm going to tell you that Trumas and Maisros is less chamor than Arla, because Arla is Asur Ma'anah, Truma's not Asur Ma'anah. A Zar is allowed to get benefit from Truma. He's not allowed to get benefit from Arla. So I'm going to say if Arla is Asur in Chutzlaritz, then how much more so Truma should be Asur in Chutzlaritz? And the answer is no, it's halacha Moshe Sinai that this Arla in Chutzlaritz. You don't have any green light to derive kal v'chomers from halacha Moshe Sinai. But that's Dokvit Tishka. Ubevai askinu. Nema bebailim that the Bala carbon was nitma b'sheretz. Ubeman ibn Nazir is mimahani. With the tumah of the Nazir, if the Nazir, right? If we have to know exactly more of Naziris, well, let's see what the pasuk it says. Kiyomas mes. The pasuk says Hayoma Rishonim Yiplu, meaning that the tumah completely destroys the Naziris because Kiyomas mes Allah. Omar Achmon. So the Torah says that in the Parsha of Nazir, only if he contracts tumas mes, but other tumas, even if he knows that he was that's not soser as Naziris. So for sure, if the Nazir contracted tumas sheretz in a tumas tahom, certainly ain't Nazirutzo nisteres. I mean, even if it was tumah yedua, it would not be nisteres. So it's impossible to say that Rabbi Chia is coming to exclude the tumah of sheretz in the case of a Nazir, because there's no havamina that the Naziris should terminate as a result of tumah sheretz, even if he was vada. Ela b'yosei Pesach. It must be that this rice of Rabbi Chia is coming to exclude tumas tahom of sheretz in the case of an osa Pesach. So we'll call him Ruvain, brought his korban Pesach, and now they brought him a package, and he didn't know what was in the package. He found out later it's a sheretz, and the question is, was he tamei at the time that he brought the korban? And I'm going to say in such a case that the tzitz is not maratza because the halacha Moshe Sinai of tzitz maratza al tumas tahom is limited to tumas mes. This can make sense if you hold. Again, this is a sugi we didn't get up to yet. That ain't shochtin v'ain zorkin al tmei sheretz. If the bailim contracted tumas sheretz, we're not going to bring the korban Pesach. And therefore, Rabbi Chia wants to mechadish that even if his tumah was a tumas tahom, but nevertheless, since it was a tumas tahom b'sheretz and not b'tomei mes, there's no ritzui. Just 1 second. So ein shoftin is a pesan and al tomei sheretz. But what about a person who is metame with a tummy sheretz of tahom? Maybe there we could go ahead and check the korban, and that's what the Rabbi Chia wants to mechadish, that there's no halacha Moshe Sinai in tumas tahom with regard to sheretz. Ela man dioma shoktin v'zorkin al tmei sheretz. That means even if he was a vadai, we would still go ahead and be makriv the korban Pesach. Is hashta tuma yedua. Oh, beautiful. If we knew about the fact that he was mitami b'sheretz, nevertheless hutralo, we can bring the korban Pesach on his behalf. He's a tamei sheretz, and he doesn't need ritzui at all in such a case. It's therefore nitma b'sheretz b'tumas hatohom lo kol shkein. certainly we can bring the carbon on behalf of someone who we don't even know for sure that he was Matame to Masheretz. Elalav Bekohen. Beautiful. So Rava says our back is against the wall. We have no way of understanding, according to this man, the Omer, who holds that Ein Shoftin al Tamei Sheretz. I'm sorry, that Shoftin al Tamei Sheretz. How can we understand this brisa of Rabbi Chia to limit the halacha Moshe Sinai of Tumas Tahom to the case of mess and not apply it to Tumas Sheretz? If even if it was Badai, we would still bring the carbon on his behalf. The answer means, must be it wasn't the Bailim, the owner of the carbon, Reuben, who brought the carbon, who was Tomei Tumas Sheretz B'Tahom, but rather it was the Kohen. Ishmami, no, we have to derive from this that Tumas Mes Hutrul Kohen, in the case of Tumas Tahom, again, we're talking about Tumas Mes, and now Rabbi Chia comes in and he says only Tumas Mes lends itself to the tzitz being Maratza on Tumas Tahom, but not Tumas Sheretz. Because if not for this statement of Rabbi Chia, we would say that as far as Tumas Kohen is concerned, where the Kohen HaMakriv is a carbon, he contaminated himself with a Tumas Sheretz Shel Tahom. We're going to say that the tzitz is not Maratza, and the entire halacha l'Moshe V'Sinai of Tumas Tahom is limited to Tumas Nes. It doesn't apply to Tumas Sheretz. And that means that this halacha of Ritzi Tzitz in Tumas Tahom applies not only to the Bailim, but also to the Kohen. It comes on Reb Chia, and he says that only applies in Tumas Mes, where there's halacha Moshe Sinai of Tumas Tahom, and not to Tumas Sheretz. Okay, Rabbosai, so this is where we're going to stop. I mean, again, it's a beautiful proof of Rava, because he's saying we have no other choice other than introducing the Kohen, into the picture. Okay, then? All right, Shkoyach, thank you.